Practice number 2 here at Nexus in our series on Nexus 7 core practices. You can see them up there. This week we're on number 2. Here it is. As a community traveling the Christian path together, we want to do so in the company of a caring community, which means this. We're going to ask you to treat everyone here with respect and dignity. Or I can expand it this way. You can see it on the screen. Our desire at Nexus is this: to see everyone treated with fairness and compassion, regardless of who they are or the life they live. We believe there's a place of love and respect for everyone on this path, and as such, we seek to provide a caring space for everyone where the value and dignity of all people is recognized and affirmed regardless of economic power, gender, mental health, physical ability, race, sexual orientation, age, appearance, political affiliation, or theological beliefs. We understand all people to be made in the image of God, and as such, we will work to affirm the worth and dignity of everyone. We strive to be a church community that practices welcoming, accepting, and serving all people without qualification. That's the kind of community we want to be. That's the kind of community we want to practice being. To me, this seems intuitively obvious as a church that we would be this. So why do we want to name this as intentional, be explicit about this? Why name this as explicitly our intention as a community? Well, great question. I'm hoping you will return with me now to the great mystery of the Anasazi people, the riddle that surrounds their disappearance. I want to talk about them and what happened to them, and hopefully it will bring a frame of reference as to why being a caring community is so important. And we're going to have to talk about violence this morning. I was a little nervous about that. And then Brian reminded me that the Christian faith is about this guy Jesus who was crucified on a cross. So, we're used to talking about violence here. But just a heads up. If you missed last week, the Anasazi people were a group of people who lived in the U.S. Southwest for about 1,000 years before they mysteriously vanished around AD 1300. And what they left behind is astounding. Dramatically beautiful, but incredibly inaccessible cliff dwellings, which we're going to talk about more next week. And they left behind a whole series of beautiful art, remarkable rock art. What happened to them? Where did they go? We know these people were a migratory people. Archaeologists know through tree ring circles that a severe drought hit the area between 1250 and 1300. So part of their disappearance is attributed to a people in search of water, migrating where the rains were. Fair enough. But archaeologists today believe that whatever happened to the Anasazi, the circumstances surrounding their disappearance came with both a pull, and a push. Got that wrong. A pull and a push. The pull was water. They were looking for water, migrating towards that. But there was also a big push. What was it? I'm glad you asked. It appears that as this drought hit the region, resources were dwindling, and suddenly the world of the Anasazi grew incredibly hostile. Archeological excavations reveal a pattern that seems to have played out at hundreds of Anasazi sites dating back to this time period. Consider a sleeping Ute mountain. They say that you can see the form of somebody sleeping there, toe on the left side, head on the far right. It looks like somebody sleeping. I've been to this area. I had no idea so many excavation digs have been performed in this area. But this is an area about 30 miles as the crow flies from Mesa Verde cliff dwellings. Between 1990 and 94, a number of digs were done in the area. And what caught my attention was 2 sites, in particular because I could find pictures of them. So that's why I'm focusing on 2. But what happened at these sites were indicative of what happened at hundreds of Anasazi sites. Castle Rock Pueblo. In the top of the screen, you can see what Castle Rock might have looked like back in the day. Bottom right is satellite imaging of the ruins, and bottom left is what the site looks like today. Now, between 1990 and 1994, archaeologists, they mapped and excavated the site. They came to believe that the village consisted of 40 rooms, 15 kivas, 9 towers, 2 dams nearby. The population was about 100 people plus children. So think about us here. This is the population of this site. All of us living here. You can see from Castle Rock, it was built around a sturdy chunk of rock that served as this natural fortress. But things got interesting and eerie during the excavation. What they uncovered was this piece of rock art. Now, if you consider art and its meaning, it might not take much imagination to think about what the meaning of this might be. To me, it looks like two people back to back trying to defend themselves. And here's the thing. Archaeologists, they only excavated 5% of this site, only 5%. But the excavation that they did do, it makes this piece of rock art really disturbing and haunting to me. Crews came upon the partial remain of 41 bodies in a state of disarray. Human bones scattered all over the place, as if they'd been hacked apart. The surveyors of this particular site remarked that the excavation looked like a crime scene. People killed trying to get away, others killed in their hiding places. Skulls everywhere. In fact, one of the most big debate in the archaeological community is this. Human feces was found, and it had the DNA of 3 human beings in it, so they believed that cannibalism might have been at play at this particular site as well. It was gruesome. The excavators doing the site, they thought, wow, what a shocking discovery. And to invade a place like this, they've put together, must have taken at least 200 warriors. Disturbing. And it might be a one-off if they didn't keep finding these sites. Consider Sand Canyon Pueblo. Like Castle Rock, it was a fortress sort of area, but much larger. 420 rooms, 90 kivas, 14 towers, built around this sort of craggy head of a canyon. And you can see on the screen, top left and bottom right, there's satellite images of what the site possibly looked like. Then top right, there is satellite image put, of course, on top of a picture today, and that's bottom left what it looks like, what's left today. They had a 1-story perimeter defensive wall around the whole pueblo, but the wall did not hold. Excavators at the site, they found a bedlam, again, of human bones. It was a scene of cruel violence, corpses everywhere, most of them with blows to the back of the head. This has been a hand-to-hand combat area. These were not quiet deaths. I'll spare you the specific details of the site because they're grisly and brutal, but this has become an all too common finding with the Anasazi sites. Craig Child says this: the archaeological record from the 13th century around the Four Corner reads like a war crimes indictment. Infants and children burned alive, skeletons marked by butchery, entire villages left with bodies unburied. Rock art depicts people bearing round, decorated shields, using weapons on one another. There's no getting around this bizarre evidence that beyond drought and lack of water, right before the Anasazi vanished, the whole region seemed to come under attack. It was a hostile and unwelcoming place to be. And so, on top of the original Anasazi riddle, where did they go? There's another element to the puzzle. Who was it that was attacking the Anasazi people? Was it wandering gangs, nomadic hunters, some kind of old enemy, some kind of warring clan? And to this day, there's been no definitive answer found. But here's the thing. For a long time, researchers, they've been desperately looking for evidence of outside invaders, and they can't find it anywhere. And so the conclusion, the leading hypothesis is this: the attackers, it appears, were the Anasazi themselves. They turned on each other. In a world that had become harsh and hostile, in a world of dwindling resources, a once great nation of people turned in on themselves. It's believed that the Anasazi, they sort of consolidated into local alliances. And it's weird because these people existed for 1,000 years in relative peace and harmony, and then they turned on one another. And it's telling to me because whenever external pressures in the world get hot and heated up, this story of exclusion and hostility plays itself out over and over again. The Anasazi are not unique in history. In fact, I would say this: I've been thinking of Beauty and the Beast lately. First movie I saw in the theater. Love the song from it. Tale as old as time, song as old as rhyme, communal hostility. That, to me, is the song that gets played out over and over again. What does this have to do with us being caring community? I mean, obviously, the story of the Anasazi is very dramatic, but the same pattern plays itself out over repeatedly. I think this, for any tribe or people or community, the temptation to spiral into hostility and exclusion always exists. It's always simmering right there under the surface. In fact, the early church, you could say, was exactly this boiling pot, this pressure cooker of social divisions ready to explode almost at any time. I think the Apostle Paul, I love the Apostle Paul because I think he spent most of his time actually trying to make sure that this pressure cooker of divisions socially, ideologically, it didn't explode. And you see, the vision of the church from the beginning had always been about a community of people who would transcend their differences, not get rid of their differences, transcend their differences by centering themselves around Christ and his way. But as is always the case, this vision was very regularly met with human division, quarreling, real hostilities. And Paul, he labored endlessly trying to keep this pressure cooker from exploding, trying to keep this vision of the church as a truly caring and welcoming community. We see this in two particular places that I find fascinating. The first is when he has to call out Peter. And I love this scene because Peter gets it handed to him here. And it's fascinating because Peter in Scripture in the New Testament, he was the leader. He was instrumental in working towards the inclusion of the Gentile people into the church. This was a hot button issue of the day. Should the Gentiles be let in? Peter led the charge. He was the first one. Said, yes, God is at work among them. Let's let them in the church. But then Paul has to confront him later on because he moved from being inclusive of the Gentile population to excluding them. This is how Paul records the story of Galatians 2. When Peter came to Antioch, I had to oppose him to his face, for what he did was very wrong. When he first arrived, he ate with the Gentile believers who were not circumcised. But afterward, when some friends of James came, Peter wouldn't eat with them anymore. He was afraid of criticism from these people who insisted on the necessity of circumcision. As a result, other Jewish believers followed Peter's hypocrisy. Even Barnabas was led astray by their hypocrisy. Notice the play. Paul has to confront Peter because when push comes to shove, he was excluding them. And it's fascinating to me because Peter was the one who led the charge to include them in the first place. The animosity between Jews and Gentiles ran deep, so deep, it was ready to explode at any time. And Peter lobbies for their inclusion, and then social factors come into play. Gets pressure from friends, from other leaders, and he moves to exclude them. And Paul, I love it, he's so bold. Well, I'll call you out, Peter. I don't care who you are. Or notice what happens in the church at Corinth. I love this. Paul established the church there, and he writes them with some stern words because as their practice of community, they were intentionally marginalizing and excluding the poor. And it all focused around this idea of a love feast that they would have together. Here's what Paul says to them. In the following instructions, I cannot praise you, for it sounds as if more harm than good is done when you meet together. First, I hear that there are divisions among you when you meet as a church. To some extent, I believe it. When you meet together, you're not really interested in the Lord's Supper. For some of you go hungry. Where did I go? For some of you, hurry to eat your own meal without sharing with others. As a result, some go hungry while others get drunk. I love this line. What? Don't you have your own homes for eating and drinking? Or do you really want to disgrace God's church and, shame the poor? What am I supposed to say? Do you want me to praise you? No. I'll certainly not praise you for this. Love it. At its core, same issue that Paul confronts Peter with. Your practice as a church, Corinth, is exclusionary, it's hurtful, and it shames your most vulnerable members. It's a disgrace. For many, the church at Corinth had become a hurtful and hostile place to be. And instead of transcending their differences, the church highlighted those differences, used them as a weapon to marginalize. This is always the way. Socially, ideologically, these differences are always simmering below the surface, and they threaten to make our communities toxic and hostile. And I think the reality is this. In today's world, there's a lot of these social pressures outside of the church already, and I think a lot of people already feel like the world is a very hostile place. I think many people today feel afraid, feel alone, without a place. They feel rejected, they feel excluded. The idea of a caring community seems elusive. And this is the key for me. This is why at Nexus we want to be intentional about stating the kind of caring space we want to provide here. We're not perfect, far from it. But here's the thing for me. If history and scripture teach us anything, it's that communities can unravel very quickly. But we strongly believe that is not the path Christ has asked us to travel. We believe the path Christ calls us to should be a path you can travel with in a caring community. And here's the thing, this doesn't mean living under the illusion, right, that we'll resolve our differences and live happily ever after. Those differences aren't going to go away. Overcoming differences was never the point. The Christian path doesn't call us to get rid of differences, it calls us to transcend them and to create an environment of love and respect in spite of them. And so I would say this, regardless of the differences that set us aside this morning, if you're willing to travel the Christian path with us, welcome. We want to try our best to be a community that welcomes, embraces, serves everyone. That's what we're trying to create. And we want to be intentional about stating that so that it's up front there, so that we remember, constantly are reminded, you know what? No matter tensions simmering below, we're committed to traveling in a caring community with one another. Now, I've asked two people to share this morning, and I'm going to ask Melissa Bowman to come first, because if there's anyone who's taught me more about caring communities, I'm not sure who it is. Melissa has been very influential on shaping my thinking around what it means to be a caring community. And then I'm going to ask Tara to come after Melissa. Tara is a neighbor and a friend, and her and Mike have told me a very powerful story about what's at stake when communities aren't caring. And so I've asked her to come if she would share a little bit about why it's important that we be a caring community. So I'm going to ask Melissa to come first and share, and then after that we'll have Tara come. If this mic starts being funny stuff, Cody, if it goes out again, because I don't want to do that to you, I'm going to grab that mic real quick and I'll hand it to you. So Cody, if it goes out, we'll use that mic. But Melissa, there you go.
So for those of you who don't know, I'm a preschool teacher. And there are lots of challenging things about that job, but there's also lots of really enjoyable moments. My favorite thing about working with young children is the things that they say. Sometimes insightful, sometimes curious, and often very funny. I remember having a conversation with a parent one morning, and a preschooler came over to tell me that the parent I was talking to has a really big nose. Quiet at first, I hoped to simply ignore this child's observations and carry on the conversation with the parent. But of course, the child desperately wanted me to acknowledge and agree with his observation. So he continued to repeat his comment over and over again, each time more loudly than before, so I had no choice but to acknowledge him. Or another child who, while helping the rest of the group search for different types of lines, straight lines, zigzags, and so on, for our class line hunt, was thrilled with her discovery of lines. As she leaned in close to me, she loudly and proudly announced, "Melissa, I found lines. They're on your forehead." So we all know that children's honesty can be humorous, and we can appreciate their words for the innocent comments that they are. But as adults, we also know that the comments of others can actually be really painful and cause a lot of hurt, especially when we discuss topics that get at the heart of our identity, of who we believe ourselves to be and how others may perceive us. That's why I believe it is essential that we are committed to making Nexus a safe and caring space, a place where all people are valued regardless of their identities or status in life, such as economic status, gender, race, sexual orientation, or physical ability, just to name a few. A caring space is a term I prefer over safe space, as we cannot guarantee a truly safe space for everyone. However, we can commit to caring for all in our spaces, creating space where we can care for ourselves and others together. I'm particularly fond of Morgan Guyton's description of a safe space as a community rooted strongly enough in grace that everyone is safe, and it is okay to have questions, doubts, and passionate opinions as long as we speak in love. That's easy enough to say, but what does that actually look like in practice? It does not mean that we all need to walk around on eggshells, avoiding conversations of substance and possible disagreements. It does mean that we listen first and speak second, or not at all, as well as giving feedback only when asked, and prioritizing the building of trust and love, community really, over making a really great point about something. Morgan Guyton refers to this as simply intentional, proactive hospitality. And as much as it is a simple notion, it is also a radical one. As Brad mentioned a few weeks back, being in community with one another can be messy and it can be challenging, but it is also likely one of the greatest things that we are called to do, to be part of a community. And as image bearers of God, I believe that we need to welcome, accept, and serve everyone without qualification. One way to head down that path is through a commitment to creating caring spaces.
So Brad asked Mike and I to reflect on caring community. So I'm going to share a little bit of our story about why a caring community matters to us. So I've been seeing a counselor again. In the wake of another significant life change, the birth of baby number 3, a checkup was in order. In the past, my postpartum anxiety was the focus of those discussions in counseling. We went through cognitive behavioral therapy, and I learned coping strategies and how to confront wrong thinking and drive it back. But this time around, we've been unearthing deeper things. In this most recent session, after admitting that I felt the need to be perfect, owing probably to my personality, but also to some significant teachings I received from the church while growing up, my counselor started to ask a question, paused, and then said, okay, I am going to ask this question. If Jesus were in the room here right now, what would he say to you about your upbringing in this instance? He would say it was wrong, I said, and my eyes immediately filled with tears. We explored this a little deeper, and I quickly realized that I wasn't emotional, owing just to this question and my answer. I was emotional because of how much my upbringing of principles over people has done damage, not just to myself, but to everyone that it's touched. In my opinion, this is a significant failure. Jesus was never principles over people. He was always people first, even where he was harshest. It was for the sake of people, to protect or to try to reach. Yet somehow, and I can't trace where it went wrong, it became more important to believe the right things than to care for people. In my wrestling with LGBTQ issues and how they align with Scripture, keeping in mind I came from a very conservative faith tradition where even being gay was considered a sin and the result of wrong choices, the slippery slope was a frequent argument against compassion. If we show people grace, we're allowing them to live in sin, and if we allow this, then what's next? Those who were affirming or even just sympathetic to the LGBTQ community were accused of being lackadaisical with their beliefs and allowing their love of LGBTQ people to stand in the way of their faithfulness to Scripture. There are many ways to read Scripture, and naturally I think I'm now reading it the right way. But I also know that I thought I was reading it the right way before. The only difference now is that I believe that God would want our love of people to stand in the way of our interpretation of Scripture. I believe that if our interpretation means that we are harsh, judgmental, exclusive, or mean, then we need to change our interpretation. In 2007, about 10 years ago now, my husband Mike and I both faced enormous challenges. My best friend came out as gay. Mike's best friend, who had come out a couple of years before, was sinking under the waves of his depression. My best friend told me he felt like God didn't love him anymore. Mike's best friend, after trying church again and facing homophobic remarks from the pulpit, was done. I lost my best friend. It took nearly 7 years of wrestling for me to finally resolve my faith with my compassion, to unpick teachings that I'd readily imbibed despite their unloving nature. I believed everything I'd been taught so fully and wholeheartedly that I wasn't even slightly aware of how hurtful it was. And when my way of believing came to light in the wake of my friend's coming out, I did him a lot of harm. And even though we both tried, it was impossible for us to remain friends. Mike lost his best friend, but in a different way. After years of wrestling with depression, his friend couldn't fight anymore. And I vividly remember my phone call with Mike. And the paramedics were still in the house. And he had snuck away to call me. And I was in Kingston at the time. And I remember standing in the dark in a friend's kitchen while everyone else was in the basement watching a movie, looking out on the dark neighborhood where there was a single light illuminating an empty playground. It is undoubtedly our friends who suffered most. And it is undoubted that they suffered spiritually as well as mentally and emotionally. And it is undoubted that they suffered outside of the church, or parts of it at least, that have decided that their sexual orientation is unforgivable. I can't speak to the specifics of their suffering, but I can speak to my own. For even having close gay friends, I was alone in the church. I remember conversations with people that involved hurtful jokes about sexual orientation, that othered our friends, that never once wondered how we were doing in the midst of all of this, and that would talk brazenly about how our friends' decisions were responsible for their suffering, even in the wake of death. While we each eventually found online supports, Christians who upheld the sanctity of Scripture and of LGBTQ people, and then later in-person supports in our immediate, personal, face-to-face communities, the most acute periods of our wrestling and suffering happened alone. To springboard off of what's been said here at Nexus over the past couple of weeks, I think the difference between growth during struggle or suffering is in how we're supported by the people around us. It didn't matter what our communities believed when we were struggling. It mattered whether they cared, but they were more worried about what we believed than whether we were suffering. So Mike and I feel strongly about being welcoming and caring for people, especially in acute periods of suffering. This does not necessarily translate to action, and for every time we do it right, I can pick out a dozen times we drop the ball or do it wrong. But we know what it's like to suffer, and we know what it's like to suffer alone. And we know what it's like having even one person reach out in even the smallest way. One spark of light is enough to blow back against a room full of darkness. And that's why this matters.
Thank you for courageously sharing, Tara. I know that wasn't easy for you. And it's not easy to know what to say after that, except to say that the stakes are real. And the reason we want to be intentional about being a caring community is because it matters. And so many people experience this world as hostile. And we don't want this place to be one of them. I think the best way after something like that is to just go to music. And so this song, I just heard it this week when I heard that the three of you were going to do a trio. And it's a beautiful song. I hope you will maybe join in towards the end. And then after this, let's just go in peace. I will say this, next week is the flip side of the coin of this week.